My honor and pleasure to be here with Rabbi Professor Marty Lockshin, who served for 38 years at York University in various capacities and has been a light in the world in Jewish studies, in Bible and far beyond, and a mentor to many of us who are in the modern Orthodox community and well beyond. And our topic today is to think about the value of the Hebrew language. So I guess the first question I would ask you is, why is Hebrew itself important?
Hebrew language ability has been a characteristic of learned Jews all through history. And while it's true that for most of Jewish history, not that many Jews actually spoke Hebrew, but a Jew who was literate was literate in Hebrew. And sadly, that isn't the situation anymore today.
Is the modern Hebrew that we speak today, is that really Hebrew in its authentic form?
Like any language, including English, modern Hebrew borrows words from other cultures, and the language is changing all the time. And those of us who moved, like me, from Canada to Israel are always frustrated when we find that the hardest words to understand in the newspaper are actually the English words that are there, and we're expecting a Hebrew word to show up there.
Right.
But that's a standard way in which languages grow. But I would argue that the modern Israeli who speaks modern Hebrew can open up the Bible, particularly prose passages of the Bible, maybe not biblical poetry, because nobody can understand biblical poetry, but can open up a prose passage of the Hebrew Bible and can understand it. And better than you and I can understand something from Shakespeare that we haven't studied before, and that we need to have little notes to explain to us, because English has changed so quickly. So in fact, I would argue that modern Hebrew is closer to biblical Hebrew than modern English is to Shakespearean English.
Very interesting. So people like you and I, to a greater extent you, really appreciate that, and for the learning value and for the living culture. But for the alienated diaspora community, those who are perhaps younger, more alienated from Judaism, how important is it that they engage with Hebrew? It feels like we spend so much time having them bang their heads against the wall learning this language. Should they be doing that, or should they really just, invest their time somewhere else?
So I would argue that Hebrew has the advantage that it isn't liberal and it isn't conservative. It isn't orthodox and it isn't reform. It isn't Jews who see religion religion as the essence of Judaism, and Jews who see ethnic identity as the essence of Judaism, or those who see national identity. For all of these groups, Hebrew plays a function, maybe not the same function, but it's something that can unite all of these people who have different approaches to Judaism. And from that perspective, if there's somebody who's totally alienated from their Judaism, you're right. The Hebrew language is not going to turn them on and cause them to be excited. Although I think it's a beautiful language, and my wife has organized a group in Jerusalem of people who just get together. We speak English, but we sit there reading Hebrew poetry, and we just think that it's like really beautiful poetry. So I know people who have been turned on just from the experience of studying a very nice language that has more history to it than the language that you and I are speaking right now. The language that you and I are speaking right now, Rav Shmuley, is a pretty young language.
Yeah. So I think my biggest challenge is the gendered nature of Hebrew. I think that I've moved towards not addressing God as he, and sadly, I didn't really get this until I had a daughter, who I started to realize, I didn't want my daughter to think of God as a man, as a young child understands the world in a concrete fashion. So, and in English, it's quite easy to dodge that, even in translations, even though they're a little clunky sometimes. But in Hebrew, you really can't avoid it. So I wonder, how deep do you think this flaw is, and is there any way to navigate that?
Right. So, first of all, you're right. It's a problem. Yeah. Hebrew is more gendered than English is. But I would say a few things. There are many gendered languages in the world, and we're not going to be abandoning those other gendered languages. Right. There are workarounds in Hebrew, too. When I was teaching a course at Bar Ilan University a number of years ago, I asked people how to get around this gendered aspect when speaking to the students, and they said speak to the students in plural, because the plural forms are the same. You know, you put the instruction on the test. If you say write an essay about, if you write that in singular, then it's gendered. But if you write it in plural, there's no difference between the masculine form and the feminine form. So there are these there are these workarounds. I also would argue that the gendered nature of the Hebrew language is, it's not really connected to gender. That, you know, the fact that a window is masculine and that a bed is feminine, all of these things are have nothing to do with the content of it. It's a grammatical element of the language. I remember when I studied German, and they told me that the word for a young woman is neuter. It's not masculine, and it's not feminine. You know, what an insulting thing to say that a young woman is not. It's not a feminine noun. So, you know, but when you realize that these are just grammatical decisions, the way the language was constructed. And just on a personal note, one of the hardest things for somebody who moves to the state of Israel is getting the masculine and feminine correct, particularly for numbers. And I still struggle with that, even though I consider my Hebrew to be quite strong.
So looking at the 21st century, what are some of are there new evolutions or directions the Hebrew language is moving in? And what's kind of guiding that process?
Right. So languages are generally guided by the way people speak. Right. Moses Maimonides said this, that the people criticized Rabbinic Hebrew and said that Rabbinic Hebrew is not grammatical, it's got too many mistakes in it, and Maimonides realized the nature of language and said that a language is what people speak. And if that's how the rabbis spoke Hebrew, then that's correct Hebrew. And that's generally how languages progress, is just on the basis of the way that people speak. The story of Hebrew in the 20th century is the story, the amazing story of an engineered language, where people decided that they were going to create a language almost out of nothing. There was a rich literary tradition, but it wasn't a spoken language. And in 1924, when the Technion was opened in Israel, the decision was originally made that classes would be taught in German, because that was the only thing that made sense. Because how in the world are you going to teach sciences in Hebrew when the professors don't know Hebrew and the students don't know Hebrew, and people forced them. The Zionist movement said it's impossible to open a school that's going to be in German, and so they struggled, and they created it. I remember one time a colleague of mine at York University and from the biology department called me up and said, "Can I buy you a cup of coffee? I want to ask you a few questions." I said, "Sure." And he wanted to know how Hebrew succeeded in turning into a spoken language in the 20th century, and why did he care? Because he was an advocate of Esperanto, and he wanted to know if the people who were advocating for Esperanto could learn from the experience of Hebrew. And Esperanto had a lot of great, intelligent people behind it, and the wonderful idea of the entire world speaking one language. Isn't that a great idea, that we should all speak one language? The Tower of Babel. Okay, so right. Yes, but somehow the force of people like Eliezer ben Yehuda, he gets most of the credit, but there were other people who really were extremely forceful about the idea of, still occasionally. A few years ago, I was walking out of a synagogue in Jerusalem speaking English to a friend of mine, and somebody yelled out at us, "Ivri, daber Ivrit." Hebrew person, speak Hebrew. And we used to hear that line, 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago. That's how it was. There was social pressure created. Wow. So, and that's the way. So it is an amazing story of... That
was about shutting out the rest of the world, or that was really about concretizing our commitment?
Concretizing our commitment, yes.
Very nice. So when you look at all the Mefarshim, all the commentators, did they understand Hebrew well, or were they kind of struggling to write in that language?
I think they understood Hebrew extremely well.
Yeah.
I don't think they spoke Hebrew.
Wow.
And I think that from around the year 1 until the year 1900,
Right.
there was hardly anybody in the world who was speaking Hebrew on a regular basis. It was a literary language in the same way that Latin is a literary language, and the same way that classical Arabic is a literary language, that hardly anybody ever speaks classical Arabic. Nobody speaks Latin. So Hebrew was and it would have remained that, and it would have been the sign of a literate Jew. Literate Jews are able to read Hebrew. And now we have the irony that we have a situation that there are many extremely knowledgeable, extremely literate Jews who can't read Hebrew anymore. But that's the bad news. But the good news is we have 7 million Jews in the world who speak Hebrew. And we never had a number as large as that at any point in Jewish history.
Wow.
And it's exciting.
And with all the creativity that's emerging in Israel, I feel like a lot of the American Jewish community misses out on that. North American Jewish community misses out on that.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So my last question for you is just a practical one, which is, I meet so many people who say they want to learn Hebrew but don't know where to go or what to do. What would you advise them to do?
The only way to learn a language is by attending language classes and doing exercises, and it's. I hate to use the words, but it's rote learning. That's how you learn that's how you learn a language. You have to slug it out. It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen miraculously,
Right.
and occasionally, you look at the situation of how people who go to a yeshiva learn the language of Aramaic.
Yeah.
They learn the language of Aramaic without anybody ever teaching them anything about Aramaic, and they just, the teacher reads text to them, and it's a terrible way of doing it, but there's so many hours that are put into it.
Yeah.
Anybody who wishes to learn a language is going to have to dedicate, hundreds of hours
Right.
to doing it, and we all know how difficult it is to convince English speakers to learn another language,
Right.
because English is the lingua franca of the world right now. All over the world people speak English, so I know anywhere that I go in the world I'm going to be able to manage with English, so why should I learn another language? Well, I think that there are Jewish reasons for learning another language.
So I lied. One more question.
Good.
What do we learn about Israeli society by where Hebrew borrows words? Like
Yes.
when Hebrew borrows from Arabic,
Yes.
when it borrows from English,
Yes.
what would be the third
It's-
most common
yes,
also? English
yes.
and Arabic the most common, right?
Yes, and there.
So what do we learn about-
There's
yeah.
German
Yeah.
borrowing. There's Russian borrowing.
What do we learn about how it borrows?
Yes, it's. You can never predict what's going to happen with
Right.
with Hebrew. I walked into a body shop in Israel, and sometimes the mechanic says to me, "Yesh baya im habreksim." You've got a problem with your brakes. So they take the word brakes and they put another, as if brakes isn't a plural form already. They put an im ending on it, so to make it doubly
That's
plural.
funny. That's funny.
But then I went to a different mechanic and I said, could you please look at the brake seam? And he said, "Balamim shacha beseder gamur." There is a good word for, these words are competing with each
Right.
other.
Oh, interesting.
And it's interesting to watch and see. There was a letter to the editor at Haaretz a few days ago complaining about a radio show that talked about the Tkufat holidays matchila achshav, the holiday season. Is there no word in Hebrew for holidays? Why is somebody on the radio? So there's still a few people who are fighting for the purity of Hebrew, and it's interesting watching it on the street as the new words like bilamim, it's a fine biblical Hebrew word. Balam means to stop something. So it's a very rich literary word, and so somebody smart constructed the word bilamim to mean brakes of a car, and it's fighting with the borrowing from English, and we'll see who wins.
Very nice. Well, since you moved from Toronto to Israel last year, I know you continue to teach at Pardes and online, and just wishing you so much continued success in all
Thank you.
your
Thank you
research
very
and
much.
teaching. Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure.